Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alyssa Abad, and I am Assistant Graduate Program Director at UMBC's IO Psychology Masters of Professional Studies program. So on behalf of our graduate program and in partnership with the Personnel Testing Council of Metropolitan Washington, also fondly known as PTC, and Blacks in IO Psychology, I would like to welcome everyone here tonight. We're going to hear from a panel of early career IO professionals, and we'll have a networking event to follow. We have quite a few people here, so we're excited to share tonight with both prospective, current, former graduate students in the DMV area, as well as early career professionals. I know we have a packed evening and we want to get things rolling. So I'm going to introduce PTC's president, Rob Calderon. He will be facilitating the session for us tonight. Just a little bit of background about Rob. He's a principal IO psychologist for the American Institutes for Research within their Human Capital Solutions Group. He has more than 23 years of experience working on and leading applied personnel research projects in both the public and private sectors. So without further ado, I would like to pass the ball to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Abad. Good evening, everybody. And I just wanted to go through and first, as we're getting the slides set up, do some brief introductions of the panel members. So first, we have Nchopia Nwokoma. She has a decade of experience advising organizations on improving culture and developing talent. She holds a master's degree in IO psychology. She combines her knowledge of human behavior at work, scientific methods, and evidence-based practices towards developing strategies that enable successful behavior change within an organization. Her areas of expertise include culture assessment and transformation, recognition, employee engagement, leadership assessment and development, and organizational effectiveness. And in her spare time, Nchopia enjoys spending time with her family, being involved in her community, and traveling the world. Next, we have Nastasia Fong. She has her master's degree in IO psychology and is currently employed as the operations analyst for a global international and development NGO known as IREX, which is International Research and Exchanges Board. She uses her background in IO to integrate best practices for change management, data analysis, and training and development within her organization. She recently also started her own consulting firm focused on providing org development services, the data-informed approach. Next, we have Dr. Pat Curtin, who is an industrial and organizational psychologist with the National Science Foundation. He has nearly 15 years of experience working in federal government at both larger and smaller agencies. He's been at NSF for about 5 years and works primarily with the employee engagement and federal employee viewpoint survey. In addition to this work, Pat participates in workforce planning and accountability projects. And prior to NSF, Pat worked in the Chief Human Capital Office of the Department of Homeland Security. He began his federal career at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, working in their Personnel Research and Assessment Division. And his experience in the government has involved both sides of industrial and organizational psychology to include assessment, workforce planning, to organizational research across a host of topics. And then lastly but not least, we have Dr. Jay Goodwin, who is the senior scientist at the U.S. Army Research Institute for Behavioral and Social Sciences. He serves as the U.S. Army's senior scientific expert and advisor to Army senior leaders for matters related to personnel systems and personnel management. He advises the Army's Talent Management Task Force to improve the quality and success of their initiatives, works with ARI's director to sustain and improve the quality of ARI's S&T research program, and mentors ARI scientists. Okay, so, and then just for, as Dr. Abad mentioned a little bit, so a few just the goals for today's session. Obviously, we want to provide students with tips for leveraging IO psychology in the workplace and providing any suggestions for how students can continue to enhance their knowledge early on in their careers. Also, through the panelists, they'll be able to provide practical firsthand insight that'll help supplement the information students gain while in school, and then provide any soon-to-be practitioners with realistic expectations on the job of an early career practitioner. Just one thing to note is as we go through this, please use the chat function to list any questions you might have. We'll get to as many as possible at the end, but we have a few set questions that we're going to go through with the panelists. And then again, with the last part of time, as well as hopefully in the breakout sessions, we'll have opportunities for definitely the students or anyone else in the audience to ask some questions. Okay. So the first area that we wanted to spend some time on were challenges. And so just kind of asking our participants or the panel members to kind of think about kind of everything from what are some of the biggest challenges you face in your job today. And definitely I would expect that there may be some different challenges today than there were probably about a year ago right now. Also thinking then, what are some of those challenges do you think that IOs will face in the next 5 to 10 years from now? And then in general, what is some advice that you can offer to help someone early in their career prepare for these challenges? So from this, as I moderate things, I think I'm going to kick things off with Jay.
Okay, thanks, Rob. In terms of the biggest challenges that we face in the job today, my role within the Army has always been very well grounded in research. So I've been working in the span of IO psychology a bit less on the straight applied side and more in terms of generating new ideas, doing research for the Army to generate applications going forward. The Army and DoD broadly is really interested in transforming how they manage personnel, the military service personnel. And with a ton of emphasis on that is a huge opportunity, but it also presents a really huge challenge for those of us who work in research to provide our expertise and to work in support of this. But at the same time, trying to manage realistic expectations, often in terms of, they want something that doesn't exist, and trying to work them through the process of understanding, well, what is manageable, what is realistic in terms of what they can have now, what could we get to in the next 6 to 8 years as this transformation continues to evolve. So and what's forthcoming is really the nexus between artificial intelligence research and data science as an evolving area that is driving some of what they think they can have now, and coming up with ways that our domain in terms of IO psychology and personnel science at large can really take advantage of some of the opportunities that are out there and will be coming down the pike in terms of data science, data analytics, some of the artificial intelligence technologies and simulation technologies that we could use to develop new kinds of applications in IO. So I'll hand it off to one of my colleagues for some of their perspective. Then we can loop back in terms of advice for preparing for challenges.
Sure. So turn over to Pat.
All right, thank you. The agency I'm currently at right now it's a small federal agency in relative terms, maybe in absolute terms. We're only about 1,500 people if you conclude all the sorts of employees that we hire, and that's a regular federal employee all the way out to we employ or bring in a lot of professors and deans and things like that, researchers from universities and from all over the country. And as Rob alluded to when he's setting up this question, our world now doesn't look like it used to a year ago. So we used to bring in people into Arlington to our new building from all over the country and get them set up and in place for 2 and 3 year long rotations, maybe up to 4 years. And that process goes on and on in its cyclical nature, each year. I think even our agency leadership and a lot of other company leaders and even in the government have realized that, as our head admin executive had put it, the cat's out of the bag in terms of answering the question, can we fulfill our mission working remotely? There's a lot of jobs that you have to show up for work, at your workplace, but there's a lot in this country where you don't. And some of the challenges we're facing right now in my workplace is how do we provide people the experience of being part of our organization when they're dispersed? How do we deal with the expectations they have now about being able to work remotely? That sort of thing. How do we do workforce planning? How do we handle remote work? How do we manage all those expectations on the employee side, on management side, and still get things done? And I don't, we'll have some return to normality, but I think even 5 years down the road or more, we're going to have ripple effects of everybody working remotely. It's still going to carry out, and we'll have sort of a new norm. I hate that term, but that's a new way of thinking about how to deal with remote work and how to inculcate people and make them feel part of the organization. I know there's other international organizations that have dealt with this, Coke or Marriott or something like that, that have had this issue before. It's like, how do you make someone feel like they're part of Marriott when they're in, halfway around the planet? And we may have to deal with that more with remote workers here, more closer to home. And I think that's enough for me. And then we can come back maybe to the advice.
Sure. Thank you, Pat. Nchopia, I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, thanks. Okay, so for me, I work in external consulting. So ideally, what I'm doing is helping clients solve problems in a very much applied way. But I lean on research from people like Jay and the Army and in published journals to help me guide the solutions I'm providing to clients. So a big challenge that I face is being able to obtain buy-in from executives or stakeholders in the company so that the solution that we're offering or the way that I'm proposing to solve a problem actually takes effect in a meaningful way. So I'll share a quick example of what I mean. I had a client who came and they were struggling because employees didn't really have clarity on how to develop in the organization, and they also didn't have any insight into how their supervisors felt about them and some other things. So as a result of those findings, I suggested we do a company-wide 360 survey, which is where you provide a rating about yourself. If you have direct reports, they provide ratings on you, your supervisor rates you, and other stakeholders. And ideally, the goal here was this was going to reinforce values that they had about transparency in the workplace, improve communication, improve employees understanding what their supervisor may have thought about them or how they were perceived by others, so that they were able to close those gaps and really develop as a leader in that organization. So that was the proposed solution or the recommended approach. But working as an external client, you don't just recommend an approach and then shove it down the organization's face. You actually have to obtain buy-in. So in doing this, this looks like talking to executives and HR leaders and other stakeholders to say, this is what I'm recommending. What are your thoughts? What are your concerns? And then listening to them, getting their feedback, and actually having to incorporate that feedback in order to get the project up off the ground. So sometimes what that looks like is very much less than ideal circumstances. And in the case of this client, what the executives wanted was they loved the idea of 360s. They hated the idea of them being anonymous because they felt like it went against their transparency values. So then it became a back and forth about, yes, we want the 360s. We love this idea. This is great. We're going to do it. However, we're going to require everyone to put their name next to what they say, including comments. And me knowing like that kind of, it takes away from the process a bit, and it takes away from the goal and what we're actually trying to achieve, but also understanding this is what the client needed to do to introduce it into their organization. So it's what I would have to say yes to, and also work with them behind the scenes and find other stakeholders to partner with so that we could pivot in the future towards having a 360 survey that was going to be anonymous. So long story short, for me, the biggest challenge I face in my role is having things like that happen where we know we know what works and what things should ideally look like, but we're not operating in a silo, and we have to get that buy-in in order to get things done. So it takes away sometimes from how things actually should be, but you just have to be patient and endure and grit and bear it, but also come up with a plan to improve it in the future.
Sure.
As far as challenges that I think IOs will face 5 to 10 years from now, I'm going to echo Jay's sentiments about AI in the future. So we're seeing AI just popping up in everywhere, all parts of our life now. They even have like water bottles that, you know, measure or report back like how much water you drank and things like that. So we're seeing that show up in the workplace, and people are really wanting to lean on data, AI, and things to really learn what's going on with their employees and to figure out how to solve challenges that their organization's experiencing and how to improve the workplace. And I think a challenge that we'll face 5 to 10 years from now is people who perhaps are using the data and AI in inappropriate ways. So for instance, if you have data or AI or something like popping up on an HR dashboard showing you that XYZ people are at high risk for turnover or maybe looking for a new job, taking that information and using it appropriately to where your goal as a leader is to think, how can I retain them? What can we do to improve their work experience? What might be contributing to these people wanting to leave? Instead of thinking, oh, well, if they're going to be leaving, let's go ahead and fire them anyways and bring new people in. So looking at making sure that we're respecting the data, respecting AI, respecting people's workplace experiences, and using it in meaningful, helpful, positive ways in the organization.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Nchopia. And then lastly, Nastasia, thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. So I don't have too much to add based on what everyone has mentioned, but some of the challenges that I experience, I would be the first person in kind of like an IO role within my organization. So having to differentiate between being an HR person, because I started on the HR team, and now having my own kind of solo role. So that's a big challenge for me, trying to differentiate what that is or even what I'm supposed to be doing in my job. Separate from that, I would also say, adding to Nchopia's point in terms of getting the buy-in for interventions and stuff, is also you might come across resistance to change, because SMT, which is senior management team, or the executive management team, might be super on board, but then when it's time to roll out to employees, it's like, no, what are you doing? We don't want this, like, no. So having to even look at the feedback from that and having to go back, some not necessarily from scratch, but looking how to better improve your intervention, and also working in an NGO. Some of the times you always hear, oh, we don't have money for this, or we don't have money for that. So trying to come up also with interventions within a budgetary constraint, and looking at alternatives in addition to all of the other issues that we had mentioned previously. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Nastasia. So I heard a lot of good and interesting challenges that I think definitely would resonate across the board. Everything from, you know, the use of AI data and how to make sure that that is being leveraged appropriately, ensuring buy-in. Kind of as I was mentioning, that budget versus like the best practices sometimes in managing the budget and things of that nature, which leads a little bit to some of those managing expectations, ability to pivot, as well as I think that the key one of differentiating the different roles IOs can have and kind of what those are. So just thinking of that, what thoughts just quickly of maybe what advice you'd give for kind of preparing for any of these challenges, and it could be in general or taking one in particular, maybe just go in reverse order. So you start with you, Nastasia.
Yep, sure. So in terms of differentiating my role from like the HR department's role, a lot of the time in communicating just in layman terms to other people, I'll say, you know, HR is an aspect of IO, but it's not the only aspect. In addition to that, we're also looking at diagnosing issues within the organization using like data approaches or information that you'll get from different data interventions, and then being able to come up with other interventions in that way to solve those issues. So looking more so at, I am a partner to HR, but I'm not necessarily within HR. So making that differentiation from early on, depending on what your role is within IO capacity. And I'd also say starting early, just being able to network with others within the field, others within other organizations, because a lot of time you'll hear that people are experiencing the same challenges that you are within your organization, and you may not necessarily have specific resources within your org, but someone else has done something somewhere else. So not to recreate the real kind of, but kind of to use their experience to kind of build on your own. So I'd say definitely branch out and try to meet people within the IO sector as well.
Definitely, very great point. Nchopia, piece of your thought.
Okay, I will start off by piggybacking off of what Nastasia was saying about staying in touch with people in the IO field, making sure you're plugged into communities and to people that you're in school with and different cohorts so that you're able to share what you're learning and also learn from what they're learning, which also requires you to have a level of vulnerability and being able to be authentic to say, this is what I've just found out, or this is what I don't know. But then also leaning on mentors and your supervisors and looking to them for guidance so that they can help you figure out what you do know and what you don't know, and they can help you learn how to address those gaps. And then being open to learning at all times. So knowing what you know, also being proud of your IO background and the perspective that we bring to situations and not trying to be everything else just because we may stick out and be different. Being okay with that, but also being open to diverse perspectives while still using your IO lens to help solve problems or challenges.
Great. Thanks, Nchopia. Thoughts, Pat, maybe go to you.
Sure. I don't know if I have anything really new to add other than to kind of build on what has just been said and say this, which is don't always look for the logical networking, the logical academic, way to go about learning new things. If you're interested in something, pursue it. If it's somewhat related to what you're doing or what you think might pay off and you've got an interest in it, go for it. If it's learning a software language, building communities, as Natasha with and interfacing with other folks outside of like traditional sort of business networking groups. I got a job by connections I made through playing softball. So, it's that kind of stuff. Just have some fun while you're doing it and pursue what interests you so that you can stick with it. There's only so many hours in a day. You're only going to get busier as things go, as life happens more to you. So being able to enjoy it, it matters a good bit too.
Definitely agreed, Pat. All right, Jay, final thoughts on this?
Sure. I'm going to go back in the direction of the data and AI stuff, as well as some of the other areas that have been emerging that it's a bit less in the applied side right now in terms of neuroscience and some of the other kind of sexy, flashy, shiny domain spaces. And you can probably guess my opinion on a lot of them from that statement. Take some classes. I honestly, I think the emphasis on data is only going to grow. And back in the dark ages, when I was in grad school, we learned SPSS and SAS and learned how to program in those languages. I think most folks in grad school now are learning R. Dig into R, dig into Python, dig into the tools that will allow you to really understand what data is and can do for you, and as importantly, what it can't do for you and what it isn't. Because you're going to get asked a lot of different ways to use data to help make decisions that would be inappropriate. And learning the ethics of data science and some of these new technological areas as they're emerging is important. And whether it's in data science or neuroscience or AI or whatever, learning to understand the strengths and limitations of these things that you will be asked to pursue is a really critical thing. There are places where you can go where what you will end up doing is really kind of core IO type stuff, and you'll be executing the various HR type processes or doing test development, and you will end up not having to deal with some parts of that. But to the extent that you are out in doing work in organizations where you're kind of in a more on-demand type mode, you'll be exposed to these types of things a lot more often. And what I see is, especially in younger folks, they've got a lot of good data skills, but they haven't thought hard about what the data is and what the data isn't, and what it can and can't do, what you should or should not do with it, what you should advise organizational leaders, what they may and probably should not do with it, and how to negotiate that kind of a discussion. That's where digging in to understand ethics and data is actually really helpful. And I'll leave it there and toss it back to Rob.
Great points, everybody. And nicely segueing is I think a few of these topics as well, we're going to dig into even a little bit more in some of these next overall questions. So let's move on to the kind of marketing your experience. I know that a few people had touched on these. So even thinking kind of globally, kind of what are some of the jobs that IOs have and the type of work that they do. And I think this goes a little bit to, I think, everything that Nastasia was saying and others too, of just the different roles. But even I think aspects of what Jay was even describing, because I know that a lot of us within the assessment realm, especially, you have the data scientists and the IOs and everyone else there. So just thinking a little bit about that. And then how do you emphasize and market your IO experience within your organization? And then maybe lastly, just kind of how do you really translate the IOs speak to the non-IOs? So kind of we'll go maybe in reverse order of how we started the last one. So starting with Nastasia.
All right, sure, thank you. So what are some jobs? I'll start there for IO. So in IO, you have the industrial side, you have the organizational side. The industrial side is more so analytical, statistics, and data driven, whereas the organizational side might be like implementing interventions and stuff. So some examples of that would be on the industrial side where I work, which is people operations. You might do work analysis, you might do employee training in terms of looking at the feedback from that, as well as analyzing that. You might do recruitment and selection. On the organizational side, you'll have stuff that has to do with job satisfaction, maybe, so doing interventions with that, looking at workplace motivation, leadership development, as well as organizational change and like change management. So that's just kind of where to start as well, to kind of differentiate where you see your side on the I or the O side, or even like a combination of both, because both sides do work together in the sense that on the data side, you collect the data to help find out and identify where the problems are. And then on the O side, coming up with those strategies and like interventions to solve the problems. In terms of emphasizing and marketing your IO experience. So I have specific experience with this. As I had mentioned, I'm the first IO person at my organization. I started out as an intern within HR, specifically dealing with anything that had to do with onboarding and recruitment, starting there, which is also part of IO, but not the main thing, or not what I saw myself doing per se, because I wanted to branch off into people operations. How I started to market myself was I saw gaps within my own role and within my own department. So within recruitment, I realized we weren't doing reporting. There wasn't any report that told us like, oh, these number of people have been hired, nothing about demographics, nothing about retention, nothing about turnover, nothing about onboarding. So I said, okay, since I have, I'm in the role that deals with this kind of information, let me set up some reportings. I also recommended different HRIS systems. At the time, we're using ADP, but we've since transitioned to UltiPro. So leveraging the reporting features as well within UltiPro to start off with reporting in that arena. And once the organization and like my direct leader and the executive management team and the senior management team realized the value of keeping stuff like this and not just doing it like once every quarter, or not even having the information that we need, because just from doing that report, it identified where we had more concrete information to say that we are lacking diversity in certain areas as it pertains to disability or veteran status, or even just race and gender. So I would say start within the role that you're in, even if it's not specifically what you want to be doing. Start with the gaps there and kind of see how you can connect with what you want to be doing in IO and leverage it from there. And you never know, like it might be branch off into doing something that is more direct to your role, which is why I'm in the position I'm in now, because I was able to leverage that from previous roles.
Sure. Thanks, Nastasia. Nchopia, thoughts on this?
Yeah, okay. So IOs have so many different types of work. So Nastasia did a good job of explaining the difference between I work and O work. But for me, my experience has been a blend of both. I grew up in boutique consulting. So I would do employee surveys and develop psychometric assessments, then have to analyze the data and then turn around, develop the intervention, turn around, present the, facilitate the training, report to do the debriefs to executives. So it was the one-man show. So that's my experience. But going to PSYOP and things, I've seen that people tend to be much more specialized. And they'll have robust knowledge as a data analyst, for instance, on the HR side, where they really understand the ins and outs of collecting data, analyzing the data. They have great knowledge in SPSS or R. Or on the change management side, where they really understand how to enable change in an organization and get people to adopt new behaviors. Or you have people who focus mainly on training. So they're experts in instructional design or adult education. You also see just people bringing their own flavors to it. So looking at your own interests, looking at what you're currently doing, and seeing where you can find a blend. I know someone who has a background in heavy experience and interest in UX. So she blends UX research and UX work with IO and has created her own thing there. So there's so many things that you can do with it. I think the important thing to know here is just to remember what sets us apart. What makes us different than HR is we take a evidence-based approach to solving problems. So HR is getting much more strategic these days, but for us, typically we take the scientific approach where we say, we're not going to use our gut. We're not going to do what sounds right. We're going to rely on literature. We're going to rely on data. We're going to rely on evidence-based practices to do this. So whatever you're doing, just looking at it that way. If people are talking and they're throwing out ideas and they're brainstorming, consider what can we do from a scientific approach or from an evidence-based practice approach to ensure we're developing a solution or solving a problem, not just using our gut. How do I market my IO experience in the organization? I really don't. I actually haven't done a good job at that. That's one of my commitments for this year, is to speak up a little bit more and do better at marketing my IO experience. What I do try to do is show how data can be used to solve problems. And I try to take a softer approach, because what you see sometimes is people have an aversion to data people. And they're like, oh my goodness, here comes the data people again. They don't understand the people. So what I try to do is sneak in some little data things and non-data-y terms as we're talking about people or how to solve problems. I'll ask questions like, well, how do you know that? Or why do you think that? Or is that one person just telling you that? Or do you have any insight into what these type of people may be thinking? And then that opens the doors into, well, no, we don't. And then it's like, well, how are we going to get that information? Well, maybe we ask the people. Well, how are we going to ask all the people in your company? What do you think we should do? Well, maybe we should do focus groups or a survey, or maybe we do a leader assessment. And then it opens the doors into that to where I can start talking about some of the more IO things. And how do you translate IO speak to non-IOs? I try to really not use IO speak when I'm talking to people who don't have an IO background, because again, I don't want to seem other or come off in a way to where people just shut down listening to me talk because they have no clue what I'm talking about. So I try to use layman's terms. Like there's certain things, like for instance, in the testing world where we'll say item, most people do not use the word item. They don't say survey item or assessment item. They'll say question. So I will, in that world, will lean into that speak so that we're all on the same page. And so I don't seem like I'm just trying to come off as different, or like I am trying to seem like I know more than them, because the goal here is we're all wanting to work together to solve this problem, make the organization better, find out who's going to be the best for the job, find out what we need to do to improve the organization. And whatever barriers you can eliminate to getting that done will make your job so much easier.
That makes sense. Thanks. To Pat, any additional thoughts on this one?
Sure, I can do some kind of quickly here. It's IO's really exciting to go off what Nchopia said earlier too. You can start off, you can do a host of things. You can start off like in a smaller boutique consulting firm. I was my first job out of grad school was a pretty small IO firm. or consulting firm. I had friends who went out of graduate, while they're still in graduate school, finishing up, went and joined the Navy and became IO psychologists in the Navy and selected pilots. And I went to school in Houston, so I had friends that went to work for NASA. I knew someone who went to work for Dell. You can either, go in-house like that. You can go work for a government agency. You can join the military. You can kind of be like Jay, where you're a civilian with the military. There's just a host of things you can do. Any kind of selection assessment you can think of, like ACT, SAT, medical school exams, LSAT, any of that kind of stuff. Those places, it's just, there's a host of things. It's really, really exciting. PsyOp has a job board that I think you can freely cruise around through and get a flavor for what's out there. It's very exciting. In marketing my experience, or marketing my IO experience in my organization, my current organization is chock a block full of PhDs of various different kinds. And they keep me on my toes. And so, whereas when I've worked at other places, I would have to translate, speak, and things like that. The organization I'm in right now, I find myself having to make sure I'm, sharp and on my toes and trying to anticipate whatever data questions I'm going to be asked next. They're very facile with the numbers, and it's nice. It's challenging in that regard, but it's a nice problem to have. And so that's kind of how, when I do translate any kind of survey information or item information or workplace information, it's a lot of times like what Nchopia said. Someone may have grown up and gone through school and got through graduate school learning a different terminology, and you just have to translate. But you're kind of both speaking about the same thing. You just got to find, how to communicate with each other. That's all.
Great, thanks, Pat. Jay, any thoughts on this one? I think maybe even just on nothing else on the translating the IO speak, since I know you're surrounded by lots of, I know you have both. You have some IOs, but then you also have to communicate with lots of non-IOs. So
A whole bunch of them. Yeah, in terms of the jobs, actually, it's funny because no one brought up the scientist practitioner model that we all have probably gotten beaten over the head with. When I talk about jobs in IO to folks, to grad students, that's one of the things that I start with, is to say, look, what do you want to be when you grow up? You can be an academic. That's what a lot of us learned. Or you can go be a practitioner and work in Deloitte. And no one really talked about all of the stuff that's in between those two extreme positions, but there's lots of different kinds of things. And if you think about it, not in terms of scientist practitioner, but more research-oriented work versus more applied organizational-oriented work, there's a lot that covers that spectrum. And in addition to that, there's another dimension that's actually represented by the four of us here, that is internal versus external. So I live kind of in the research space, but I'm internal to the Army. So I'm a domain expert in lots of areas of IO because I have to be, but as much as anything, I'm an expert in Army IO and how this works in my organization. Pat is similar in his work with NSF and his prior work with DHS. There are folks that I work with, a number of whom are our other two members of the panel, others that I can see on the screen and names that I've seen that are more applied organizational work, some internal. There are some folks who are like me, but do much more applied work inside the Army or inside DOD, and some who are external to some degree or another. So if you think about it in that kind of a two-dimensional laydown of space, you end up with lots of different kinds of jobs that you can do. The more applied you are, the more likely it is that you're going to end up bouncing from topic to topic, or unless you develop a niche area that is your specialty. I'm going to pick on Frank Landy because he's an old guy. He's not around anymore, and most people know who he is. He's a test guy. That's it. You ask Frank to do something other than testing, it's not going to work. But he was an expert at testing stuff, and he did most of his career, believe it or not, doing external consulting in that space. you know, there's other folks who become those well-known experts in those different domains. Most important for all of you folks who are just, you know, as you're in school or just trying to figure out where you really want to go early in your career, find what makes you happy. There's lots of jobs in IO that cover all of this spectrum. Find the one that makes you happy to do, happy to get up and go to work every day, even if, and as is the case for most of us right now, work is a 20-minute or a 20-foot walk from the kitchen. You know, find what gets you excited to spend all day sitting in front of the computer and let that drive kind of where you want to go. Marketing in my organization, I'm the oddball. I don't. I actually avoid it. The senior leaders in the Army know who I am. They know what I can offer. I have more than enough work on my plate and for my agency right now. We don't need more people in the Army knowing what we can do. So tamp that down. You know, kind of demarketing in a lot of ways. Translate it, you know, dealing with folks. I work with experts in a lot of different fields, and I need them to understand what we know. So I spend a lot of time translating and finding analogies in their domain of expertise or something that they know well that I can speak to. I actually was explaining personnel testing in terms of farm tools to someone 2 weeks ago, because that was an area that we could both speak to, and I could find ways to translate the points that I was trying to make to him in a way that he could use the information. And he's an Army guy, but farm tools is where we ended up because he owns a farm and he is very familiar with farm tools, and I happen to be as well. So you just find the analogies that work. Don't get trapped in IO world. Think about what it is that you're trying to do more abstractly and go with it.
Great.
So,
Okay, I have a question, a follow-up question. I know I'm supposed to be on the panel, but I just have to ask if that's okay. Jay, how long do you think it took into where you were regarded in your workplace to the point where you weren't having to market yourself? And then also, what are some of the things that you did to get to a point where your name preceded you?
I would guess it's somewhere between 13 and 15 years. So it's just been in the last 5 or so years where no, I don't market anymore. And part of that is a function of I've worked in the same organization for more than 20 years now. So I've worked in the same research activity in the same part of the Army and for the Army for just about 20 years. Things that I did before that was honestly, when I started out, I kind of bounced between being a specialist in personnel testing and a specialist in teams. And I got out of that mode. So I got exposure in lots of different ways on a lot of different topics. So I've worked in diversity. I worked on Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. I've worked in civility and inclusion. I've worked in personnel testing. That's back where I am now. I've worked in leadership and teamwork and performance assessment and assessment centers. I have bounced through a lot of different things. And because of that, I've gotten a lot of exposure over the course of time, including to our senior leaders in a way that, yeah, they know who I am now. And the last thing I want is more of them to call.
Great. I do want to move us along. One thing I will mention is, in addition to us posting the recording on our website, we actually have a few things, a few pieces of collateral that actually Nastasia provided to us that we'll also post there. It answers a little bit of the first bullet of just some of the jobs I always have and some of the types of work. So that'll also be there. It's just a nice little summary of things. Just want to mention that. So moving on to our last set of our own questions, dealing, and I think a few people talked a little bit about this from the mentor side of things. Just in general, is there anything like that you received, any helpful guidance that you received from mentors, and kind of what did you do to find that mentor? So a lot of more that upfront piece of how do you understand what you might want to focus on to maybe get to have a better understanding later on, like we were just discussing between Nchopia and Jay. So maybe even starting with this one with Nchopia for this one.
Yeah, I have received tons of helpful guidance from mentors. I have multiple mentors. I lean on my mentors. I use them to solve problems with clients in my day-to-day work. I lean on them for career advice. I mean, we do work with people who have this deep expertise in careers and making sure you're building your own great career. So I go to them for guidance about things like that. So I usually, to sum it up, lean on my mentors for help troubleshooting problems or helping me think through a solution if it's something I have not been exposed to. And no one in my organization has been exposed to it, I will reach out to a mentor and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Do you have any experience with this? Is there something that I'm missing? And then they'll help me expand my thinking, or sometimes they'll say, go read this book or go check out this webinar. As far as career guidance, I'll go and reach out to them and say, hey, this is what I'm struggling with in my career, or here's what I don't know, or here's a gap that I think that I have. What advice do you have for me on how to solve this? Or can you give me any guidance? So I really lean on them. And I I've set cadence meetings with my mentors since the beginning of time. Since I was in grad school, I have mentors that I meet with on a monthly basis, or quarterly basis, or a couple of times a year, just to check in, and just to, learn about what they're doing. And it helps me to expand my thinking, and it helps me become more exposed to things that I may not have been exposed to in the work that I'm doing that are still in the IO realm. I have found my mentors mainly through work. So the mentors I lean on now heavily, they were mentors, or actually they were my internship supervisors where I interned in grad school, that I just feel comfortable reaching back out to them for guidance when I need it. I have my advisor from grad school, that from time to time, if I run into like a really big problem at work where I do not know what I'm supposed to be doing, or maybe a salesperson has sold a piece of work and has said that I can do this, and I'm like, I've never heard of that before in my life, but now they're looking at me, I'll call him up and be like, oh my goodness, can you help me think about this? And he should probably charge me, but he never does. And then we troubleshoot it, or we take it to the class and work with, like just brainstorm and think of new ways to think of things. That's grad school, that's internships, and then former bosses. So I end up finding that when I'm in the job, I have an appropriate boss direct report relationship. Once I leave the job, the relationship evolves from direct report supervisor to mentor mentee, or even peers in a way, to where I'll have previous bosses reach out to me with questions and to help them solve problems, and I'll reach out to them with questions and for guidance.
That makes sense. Great. Nastasia, some additional thoughts you might have?
Yeah, sure. For mentorship for me, I think it's also important to clarify that you don't just need one mentor. You have different mentors that serve different purposes. I have two core mentors, one that helped me with anything that has to do with people analytics or data analysis, and my other mentor who helps with like the business aspect of IO, like how do you open a consulting firm and stuff like that. And I feel like one thing that I've learned from both my mentorship experiences is that you need to find a mentor that not also fits you from in terms of like the goals that you're trying to achieve, but on a personal level as well, depending on the type of relationship that you're trying to build. So is your mentor the person where like you have to check in every day? Like some people appreciate those kind of relationships with their mentor. That's very good to establish from the get-go. Or is it where a problem comes up, you want to talk to your mentor, then that's fine as well. In terms of how I found my mentors, it was from grad school. Two of my older professors, they were the ones that are my mentors now. I'll also look people up on LinkedIn. I'll look for people who are in positions where I see myself or where I would like to go, and I'll just randomly message them and be like, hi, you may not know me, but at the end of the conversation you will, but I'm just really interested in the work that you do. Can we have a conversation? Like stuff like that. Or looking at opportunities. I attended the PSYOP conference based on like pieces that people talk about or research that people have done. you might be surprised. Like I met a professor there while we were having the coffee break. And then by the end of PsyOp, I was helping him with his research. That definitely pointed out to me that research is not the direction I want to go into, but it's important to have those experiences so you can identify that. And simultaneous to that as well, I forgot to mention this on the marketing point, but there are lots of platforms where you can, you know, sign up to do different projects that are pro bono or volunteer experiences. So you can also find out what areas it is that you want to be working in. And one of those platforms, it's called Catch a Fire, where you can do free projects with actual organizations, but they may not have the funds to afford consultants, but they will accept like grad students or undergrad students. Or if you're new out of grad school and you haven't found an opportunity yet, but you still want to build like your reputation and experience, you can start there. So definitely looking at that and then finding people in the field, whether that's from school, from networking, from LinkedIn, whatever that may be. So yeah.
Great perspectives. And yeah, in general, I feel like the IO community, we're a relatively friendly bunch. So yes, please ask those questions, especially those with a little bit more gray hair or less hair in general. Just before we move on to any of the additional questions, just Jay or Pat, any additional thoughts on this one?
Pat, I'll round us out.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. You know, I found mentors, same place as everyone else has, you know, academic advisors, although my advisor is not one of my mentors at this point. But my academic uncle, one of my advisor's grad school classmates, is one of my best mentors and always has been, at least like almost my entire career. One of the things to remember is the mentors that you have earlier in your career may not end up being the same mentors that you have later in your career. Right. Those relationships will change and evolve, and that's fine. They're helping you grow. The point, I think, of what you're hearing all the way through this is the mentors that you need are people who help you see yourself. They help you understand where you are and where you want to go, and they help you grow in meaningful ways that you can't do by yourself. So, you know, one of my best mentors early in my career helped me understand what it means to be a leader and a manager and to mentor others. And I treasure that relationship, even though we only worked together for about 2 years. And I learned a lot from that individual. But as I've gone through the rest of my career, I have mentors kind of where I find them that can give me something meaningful in terms of that self-reflection and learning. And sometimes it lasts for a year or two. Sometimes in one case, it's lasted for most of 20 years. So it's less about who specifically and more recognizing that someone fulfills that need of reflecting back useful information to me, and they have that capacity and willingness to do it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jay. I think at this point, Mike, and I'm hoping that you can see the questions because I'm not seeing anything, but you turn it over to if there's any questions that have been coming in up to this point.
Yeah, we have received one question so far, but feel free to send more in through the chat. I'm sure everyone was very engaged and did not even think about sending questions in. But the question for the panel is, what will be the future for IO 10 years from now?
Yeah.
Future of IO for 10 years from now.
Yeah. That's an interesting question, just thinking about what's happened in the past year and what the focus has been. So who knows? I mean, there's so many factors, but yeah, any of our folks want to take the first crack at that one?
I think our core function of supporting personnel systems and organizations will always be there. I think there is a growth aspect of IO that is going to be much more responsive to events of the last year in terms of making organizations a good place to work in various ways. Whether it's the COVID inspired, everybody's working remotely, we're doing meetings and all kinds of activities through virtual means, or the diversity and inclusion issues that have cropped up into very stark public notice, that to really try to drive deep and work on how do we solve these issues in organizations in meaningful ways. And that's a big challenge for us as a discipline. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's an appetite right now I see in organizations to try to tackle it, and I think that appetite will be around for a while. I think this is a fundamental shift in our society that's happened.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That kind of goes off of what I was saying earlier that we're faced with right now in my agency, is trying to figure out how to bring in NSF experience, whatever that may be. We're working on defining that, because before we didn't really have to sort of worry about defining that, because people came to one common workplace and it just kind of happened, however it is for that person in that part of our agency. And, and even if, you're working at a Marriott in Timbuktu, you're all still there together, but in the future, we may be working for the same agency, but dispersed all over the place. And how do we make people feel part of the organization, buy into the mission and all that kind of thing, and get managers and everybody else comfortable with working remotely and getting work done that way? It'll be challenging.
Yeah. I think in the interest, I'll go through maybe the next question. People can always circle back as well. So I see the next one that's on the list was, how long should a new IO stay at a job as they gain work experience? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think this is something I think I've thought about quite often, and I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule. I think you should look at it in terms of understanding what experience you actually gained. So it's not about going into a company, staying there long enough to put them on your resume and then leaving, but actually going in an organization, be it external, internal, whatever you're doing, solving a problem, gaining experience, learning something, contributing something, and then being able to sit back, look at yourself and say, did I contribute? Did I learn? Will people here have something good to say about me after I leave? Would they want to hire me back? Would they recommend me for projects? And then using that as your gauge.
Yeah, you may find yourself, that's great. You may find yourself working at a place and you stop feeling challenged. And that may be a real good indicator to you that it's time just to move on, because if you're not being challenged, you're not growing, and there's some stress involved with being challenged, but it's a good form of stress, and it's much better than kind of resting in place.
Makes sense.
I think most people right out of grad school, at least the data would reflect, most people would work at their first job between 3 and 5 years. Between 3 and 5 years, 80+% of people start looking around to try to decide, is this really what I want it to be? Is this really who I thought I wanted to be? And a lot of them said, no, I want something else. I was one of those folks. I stayed at the organization where Rob and I met for about 4.5 years. And then I realized I wanted something different than that. So don't be bashful to leave when you're not being challenged anymore, or when you come to realize through your own growth, through your own kind of self-reflection, that what you're doing isn't what you want to be doing. It's time to pick up and go. Don't move so fast that you haven't had the full opportunity to really experience the challenge and experience what it means to do that kind of work. But, don't be bashful about moving on to something else. If you haven't yet found what it is that makes you tick, go for it. Keep moving.
Yeah. And I'd also say be transparent to the people in your organization too about what you're looking for and opportunities and stuff.
Great, thanks, Nastasia. Another question here is about how do you find jobs in IO when all your primary experiences are in a different field? In other words, choosing to work in IO as a career change. Thoughts on that?
Okay, I career changed from social work to IO. And what I did was, I think Nastasia has given this resource of Catch a Fire. That'll help you gain experience. Reaching out to grad students, professors, people in your area, letting them know what experience you're looking for and offering to support for a little while with maybe no pay, where if it's appropriate, and gaining experience that way. And then being able to see what you like and then going from there to apply for jobs and look into IO related jobs where you now have experience. So you're not coming in quite as blank, or that you're able to talk intelligently during an interview about what it is you're interested in and what you're looking for and what you're hoping to do.
Yeah, and adding to that point as well, some people might take the internship route, looking for internships and other job opportunities, or just choosing to go back to school, whether to take a program or do a full-on degree, or, you know, just to kind of test out if this is actually what you want to do, or what are the parameters that are involved in that, because in taking the courses and stuff like that, you're also exposed to other people within the IO field, which can be another way to network as well and find opportunities.
Yeah.
I
Thanks.
did.
Go ahead, Pat.
I did see a question pop up, and someone had asked, "Is there a federal site for our jobs?" And it's usajobs.gov. And you can. The comments that just got me thinking is, you know, your experiences and your skill set, your competencies will be more transferable than you think. So don't maybe get so hung up on the job title. If the work sounds interesting, if the job sounds cool, look at what competencies are in that, and then learn how to speak to those. If you apply and you get an interview, you can say, this is how my background translates into that. I did this sort of work. It wasn't specifically IO, but we were doing this kind of selection work or this kind of work with data. And even if you get your foot in the door that way, if it's a large organization or a government agency, as Jay had said, you can get in, take a breather, since you've gotten out of grad school or whatever else, kind of figure out how you feel and what you're doing and what you like, and get some time to look around and then head off in another direction. So,
And PTC for federal work, there's a whole bunch of the federal IO folks who are engaged in PTC in various ways. And even if they're not directly engaged, like me, I haven't been directly engaged in PTC for a number of years, but the folks who are directly engaged know who I am and know how to wrangle me to show up at a meeting like this. So, the DC metro area, including Baltimore, has a huge number of IO jobs across the federal government. Most federal agencies at the executive department level have IO people in them somewhere. FAA, the DHS has lots of IO people. Pat could speak to that at length. The key is to try to find the kind of jobs within the federal government that suit you. There's more applied jobs, there's more research jobs. DoD has many more of the research jobs than the other agencies. But stay in the network. The people who are engaged around here will very happily talk about the jobs that are in the federal government, because the federal government needs more IO people desperately.
Please.
Thanks, everyone. Mike, I'm going to check with you for a time check. How are we doing? Would you like us to cut it off, or are we going with our questions? I'll defer to you.
Yeah, so we are at 6:33 Eastern time right now. I say we answer another question or two, and then we will skip to the breakout for networking.
Okay, I'll do more questions. First one, because I've seen it a couple of times here, thoughts on the books that you recommend all IOs read as they matriculate through their career.
More IO books that all IOs read. Start with Casio, or whatever the current version of Casio is. And I've got 2 different versions on the shelf right here behind me. This is an old one, Kozlowski and Klein, Multi-Level Theory and Analysis. Everyone should read that. If you can't think, if you're going to work in organizations, you have to be able to think about organizations that way.
I'm gonna go with the IO Psychology Journal, so Industrial Organizational Psychology, Perspectives on Science and Practice. It's just good to stay in the loop on what's going on out there, what research is happening, what's been refuted, what's been supported, and it just keeps you like, it'll keep you on your great game. So it's not a book, but it's a good.
Mhm.
What other ones?
I'll add, there's this really great book called Never Go With Your Gut, helping you with leadership development, as well as like how do you incorporate data analysis and data informed decisions with your interventions. There's also human resource selection if you're into the HR aspect of IO. There's another book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which also gives you advice as well for incorporating interventions. And one that I read, because I had also learned SPSS in grad school, but I had read Discovering Statistics, which focused on R and Python as well, to kind of teach myself those, since I had went the traditional route of learning SPSS also.
Great. The last question, I'm going to try and aggregate a few of these. So I know there's one question about grad schools, pros and cons of on campus versus online, but also at a little bit of experience when just how do you get the experience, especially from a grad student, with many organizations requiring years of experience. So I think in general, kind of just to best prepare individuals coming out, whatever grad school it is, master's, PhD, online, in-person experiences, all those types of things. So just advice to maybe put together someone's best resume for that perspective. So thoughts on that, or how best to prepare kind of as they're finishing up grad school, or even considering grad school.
I can start off. Looking at the platforms, as I had mentioned earlier, those ones that will give you volunteer opportunities and pro bono opportunities, tag teaming with also like your professors to see if they're working on anything research related that you might be interested in that you can also work on. Looking for internships. A lot of time you don't need internships necessarily you don't need experience necessarily to start the internship, because the internship is supposed to give you experience. And a lot of time that's really good to start looking at within grad school before you finish or anything, so that by the time you are complete, you'll have that accrued internship experience, so you can look for full-time positions and so forth. So I'd say definitely start there. Looking on LinkedIn, looking on job platforms, whether it be for summer internships or rotating internships or semester internships, whatever that may be. SciUp also has a great platform. There are also other IO focused organizations like Blacks in IO. They also post opportunities within the LinkedIn group there. So that's another thing as well. You can join LinkedIn groups with IO professionals where they'll post opportunities for people to volunteer. Like I was just doing one where I was an assessor. I've never done like personnel assessment before. So that was an opportunity to do that there and learn experience and build on that.
Thanks, Nastasia. Anything else the others would like to add on that one?
Yeah, as far as job searching, I will say something that I've heard ever since I've graduated from grad school is these cries of despair from people who got their degree in IO, or they're working, or they're about to graduate and they can't find a job and they feel bamboozled because they're like, I thought there was going to be all these jobs and there's not. This is a scam. Nobody knows who we are. And I've applied for 1,000 jobs. Nobody will even interview me. And I say, let's go back to the basics and what we know to be true as IO practitioners, and understanding who we are, what your skill sets are, what your capabilities are, and understanding that you're not going to be able to do 1,000 jobs in the IO field just because you have a degree in IO, nor does our degree, or at least my program, I can specifically speak for, qualify us to be HR generalists. So that's another thing, because then people will say, oh, I can't even do HR work with this. Like, what is this thing? And the truth of the matter is you have to really understand the degree that you have, what your interests are, and be very specific and even selfish in learning everything about what you're interested in this IO field. Don't be afraid to get granular, but also don't be afraid to go too broad if it's 4 or 5 things. But also don't make the mistake of blanket applying to everything with one resume, because you're just going to be, your resume is not going to speak to the different things. Like I could never go apply for the job Jay's done, Pat's done, or Nastasia's done. I don't have that experience. Even now, I've been in my career like 10 years. I don't have that experience. I would have to go learn things to do those things, right? So the same holds true from when you're coming out of grad school or where you're trying to get your first job. Be true to yourself, be true to what you know, tailor your resume. I like to do this thing, or one thing I always recommend people do if you're still in grad school is go through LinkedIn, go through PsyOp, go through Indeed, look up the job title or look up the keyword IO psychology, look at what the different job descriptions that pop up in that world and see what resonates with you. See what looks like, okay, I would love to do that. Or look at what you think, oh my gosh, that sounds so boring, right? And the things that sound boring, make note of that. The things that pique your interest, make note of that. And then go learn everything about the things that pique your interest. So when you're interviewing, if you do get called in, you can talk intelligently and not be sprinkling in IO words that have no application for that setting just because you learned it in grad school. But then also for the things that don't pique your interest, you know when you come across it that that's not what you want to do. And I promise you, if you streamline, you're going to apply to less roles, but you're going to have greater knowledge. You're going to be able, when you go to PsyOp or when you're networking, you're going to be able to say, I am interested in testing. I am interested in selection. I am interested in data. And those 3 things, people will be able to point you to who you need to know, versus if your interests are training, change, or other things, then that's going to be a different set of people versus just coming in saying, I just like IO. I don't know what I want to do. Like help people help you by being true to yourself and knowing what you want to do, or at least what you like, or at least what you don't like.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about looking at the competencies and the skill sets that you're interested in or that you have, and don't get hung up on the job titles. If you go into these job search sites like usajobs.gov, do like Nchopia's talking about, search for what interests you and see what jobs pop up. So if you like testing, if you like personnel selection, if you like, HR professional, if you like data analyst, program manager, something like that, it's going to be a little frustrating at first, but you'll start to see commonalities pop up as you keep entering these different search terms. And that'll help you hone down, just like she was saying, and figuring out what to apply for, what matches up with what you have and what you want to do. So it's kind of fun to do, just to see. You just kind of have to learn to speak of the way the jobs are listed and the way the skills are listed. But it'll happen. It'll happen. Don't get down.
And all of us are specialized. I can't do the jobs that these other guys do.
It is almost like a law degree to that point.
Yeah.
I'm very specialized in the niche that I'm in, but for me to go be an external consultant, there's a huge, steep learning curve that I would have to go through to stand a chance at being successful at that. It's tailor resumes. Look for opportunities that don't necessarily feel like IO work. One of the things that I did in grad school to develop statistical expertise and proficiency is I basically hired myself out as a statistical consultant. So I did a project for close to 12 months in food science, helping a professor analyze her data. Well, I didn't know anything about food science. I learned an awful lot about different kinds of food and diets and who eats what, when, where, and why. But the whole point of it was to get really good at exercising those statistical skills and communicating with someone about data in a way that I wasn't used to or very comfortable with doing. And that was a big leg up very early on in my graduate career. So find opportunities that'll help you exercise skills, even if it's not in the IO area, because that'll pay off later.
Yeah, you can find some really fun things to do in that regard, and that do pay dividends.
All right. I want to say thank you to all of our panel members, and I will turn it over to you, Mike, to do your magic.
Yes, the magic. It's time for the show. Thank you, panelists. This was fantastic. I think everyone learned a lot. For those of you who are sticking around for networking, we'll be using the Zoom breakout feature. There will be a little bit of a countdown, and I'm going to try to make it such that one of the panelists, Rob or myself, are in each of the breakout rooms. Bear with me here in case that doesn't happen the first try, but then we will regroup and rematch at least once, if not twice. So we'll try to do 15 minutes per networking session in groups of about 6 to 7 people. Thank you so much for attending, and we would love you to stay if possible. Thank you.